from its contents. He replied simply. She grumbled but didn't argue the point. As they pressed deeper into the forest, Hoplite began to notice other watchers hopping around in the trees above them from time to time, all wearing a color-blending variant of Lance's garb. There were many of them, most doing about the same task, hunting for trespassers. Or more likely, with the recent development of the Fiend Wall's collapse, hunting for fiends to put down. Hoplite had learned that day watchers were given those garments to blend in better with the surrounding forest, while night watchers, such as Lance, were given light-drinking black garb to better blend in with the darkness. He didn't quite understand why they simply didn't give night watchers the same color-blending garb as day watchers, but he supposed that the color-blending version could be a fair bit harder to make than simple pitch-black clothing. The explanation for why day watchers' clothing could color shift had been, of course, magic. Hoplite had nearly given up asking why certain things were the way they were on this planet. 3 days of constantly being told, magic this, or the pillar gods, that was really beginning to frustrate him. There wasn't a shred of common sense among these elves. That was all there was to it. When do you have to? Lance started before trailing off, her eyes darting to the ground as she drew her lips to a line. When do I what? Hoplite asked, his brow furrowing beneath his helmet. Why did she look embarrassed? Hoplite had no idea why she would be. He may have lacked the social skills of most people, but to his eyes, Lance had said nothing that would seem humiliating. Maybe it was what she was about to say. When do you, I mean to say, when do you have to pee? She asked, rubbing a hand through her long black hair and seeming to look anywhere but at Hoplite. This was hardly the first time he'd been asked this question, but he was far more used to hearing it from Marines under his command. He never understood this obsession with urine. It was a simple bodily function. Hoplite supposed it was because those troops had understood that the phalanx suit had no waste disposal built in. How they would know that, Hoplite had no idea. And in truth, he simply didn't care enough to find out. I don't have to yet, he replied after a second. It's been 3 days, Hoplite. You haven't even slept, she yelled, bafflement plain on her face. I don't need to yet, he said matter-of-factly. Hoplite would like to keep it that way for as long as he could. Thankfully, he hadn't consumed anything prior to suiting up. The result, however, was that he was severely dehydrated and practically starving. It was not dangerous for him, not yet. Hoplite knew his own limits when it came to that regard, but he could not function at peak efficiency without normal sustenance. If he stopped to remove his helmet to eat and drink, however, he would have another problem on his hands later. He could go far longer without food or water than a normal human. But that didn't mean that it was healthy for him to go without it for this long. At this rate, he'd be dead within the next few days. 12 at most, but he should take care of his needs before that point. He couldn't protect anybody if he was recovering from severe dehydration alongside starvation. Hoplite found himself again wishing that the phalanx suit had come with a built-in waste disposal, but there was no use in lamenting the fact that it wasn't there. There was also the very real danger of allowing his hunger to grow. If Hoplite went Wendigo. He shook his head at the thought. He dreaded it, but it would be time to remove the suit when he returned to the pod this next visit, or at least just the helmet so he could eat and drink. The inevitability of removing the phalanx suit was what he dreaded, for the process of reattaching the individual pieces of his armor on his own would be hours long. Even with the tools Hoplite had procured from engineering before launching his shuttle, He glanced at Lance, seeing that despite all the time she had spent awake with him out in these woods, she had no dark circles beneath those green eyes. "I haven't seen you sleep, Lance," Hoplite told her. He hadn't either, of course, not since they had both set out patrolling through the fallwood. She had to take breaks here and there to eat and drink, but she had not slept a wink. Yet Lance didn't even seem the least bit tired. "Elves don't sleep nearly as much as you lazy humans do," she said with a small laugh. "Besides, I got a full 2 hours of rest before I found you. I'm good for the rest of the week." "I don't need that much sleep either," Hoplite replied. "Don't concern yourself." "Look," Lance started, fists on hips as she walked, "you need to take care of yourself before you fall over dead. Simple as that." She sniffed, shaking her head. "I can forage up some berries and bag some bunnies for you if you don't know how. And it's no bother if you want a drink from my canteen. I can't put the suit back on easily once I take it off." Hoplite said, "I want to keep it on as long as I can. It will take hours to put it back together." "Well, that's just silly. Who makes armor that hard to put on?" she said with a shake of her head. "Honestly seems stupid to me. And here I thought simple human plate armor was enough of a bother to deal with." "Our wardens..." Oh, Hoplite couldn't exactly say she was wrong. But with how complex the phalanx suit was, it was simply impossible to put it back on quickly without an engineer or an assembler to speed the process. On the flip side, though, it was surprisingly easy to take off. All it took was a certain combination of bumps with his chin, and several sections of the armor would open. After a few minutes, he could be out of the suit in its entirety. The helmet he could take off and put back on whenever he wished, but he'd rather keep wearing it until he was back inside the pod. "Just let me know when you're ready to come out of that armor. I can bag a bunny for you in no time." She told him you can cook it yourself, though, unless you don't know how to do that either. Lance finished wryly. He didn't say anything in response. Hoplite noticed that the Magnus, Visus, and Fortis felt light. It was time to go back to the pod and restock. He still had an adequate amount of ammo to spare on his person, but he wanted to stay as flush with bullets as possible. Almost right after he thought of returning to the pod, his stomach growled. He hadn't even eaten before entering cryo. Again he tried to ignore the thought, and failed. It was simply time to eat and drink. There were canteens and calorie-dense ration bars stored beneath the seats of the pod, as it was for all escape shuttles. His throat felt like burnt paper and his limbs felt leaden. His eyes were growing heavier and heavier by the day. Hoplite needed to take care of himself before his body took matters into its own hands. He promptly turned and scooped up Lance without a word, bracing his legs as he prepared to launch into a run. She only gave a small gasp as he began sprinting headlong toward the pod. She was well used to this by now, but he saw that the other watchers in the trees overhead flinched at his sudden takeoff. Their surprise at his speed could only be matched by their terror of his weapons. The other watchers genuinely seemed to be scared witless of them, but Lance had grown used to his thunderstaves by now. Seeing the power that Hoplite's guns were capable of outputting may have helped keep the watchers from attempting to bring Hoplite to justice for the damage he had done to a few of their trees. Hoplite was still unsure as to how the Harkal had voted in regard to his crash landing, but it was safe to assume at this point that he was in the clear. Lance, like the Hark Mother, had told him to be careful about the trees. Initially, Hoplite hadn't cared if the foliage was damaged, but recently, Hoplite kept finding himself trying to avoid shooting the trees. Lance had told him that the Fae inhabiting the trees would appreciate his efforts. They certainly weren't real, but Hoplite didn't feel like arguing with her over their supposed existence. When they had both first set out, Lance had told Hoplite that she was, in a way, responsible for any of the damage that Hoplite might inflict upon the woods. As long as he didn't bring any down, however, she was not at risk of punishment, at least not severe punishment. Lance had said that the chunks blasted out of the trees would at least get her a stern talking to from her commander. And apparently Hoplite himself would get his own tongue lashing eventually, at least according to Lance. Hoplite doubted it. The Feywood was a war zone, and any kind of battleground would suffer wear and tear. The Harkmother and Lance's commander would simply have to accept that fact and move on. Still, Hoplite had kept it in mind to avoid damaging the trees. There was no need to get Lance punished by her superiors on his behalf, and in truth, it wasn't the most difficult thing to avoid damaging the woods. Yet, why did he try so hard to avoid injuring them? They were just trees, nothing more. It wasn't like he feared punishment from the elven authorities. He supposed a part of the reason, one that he could identify, was that he simply found them to be appealing to the eye. Hoplite simply did not want to rupture the natural patterns of the tree's bark, for that would mar their natural beauty. Hoplite immediately turned his thoughts away from such an obscene thought. Nature was merely another potential battleground, nothing more. He was a tool, a thing meant for killing, not a human being. It was best to keep it that way, lest his thoughts eventually come to more treacherous places. He kept his attention firmly on the traveling, the speed he ran, his motion sensor, anything but the Feywood's lush colors, and its near-overwhelming sense of life. It only took an hour to reach the crash site at his top speed, and when he put Lance down, he saw that her hair had been completely blasted back by the wind. She finally opened her eyes again, placing a hand to her lips before leaning heavily against the thick trunk of a nearby tree. Her face had turned a sickly shade of pale, and for a moment, Hoplite believed that she would paint the bark with her bile. "You have to give me more warning than that, you metal ape," she muttered under her breath. "My guts are soup." Lance groaned, placing a hand to her stomach. "It is unnecessary," Hoplite replied. "It is more time optimal this way. If I were to tell you every time we were about to be en route to the pod, it would take up to a minimum of 15 seconds. It would be a massive waste of time," Hoplite explained to her. Yet instead of nodding in agreement to his flawless logic, Lance shook her head, glaring up at him. "Well, you're going to tell me from now on instead." Lance told him, "I will not be hauled about like a stone." Hoplite's back stiffened in irritation. How dare she try to order him around? "You are not in command of this operation. Do not attempt to give me any kind of orders." Hoplite bit back, the heat in his voice only barely contained by ice-cold discipline. "In case you forgot," Lance said after a second, standing straight to look up into his helmet, "you aren't my commanding officer, Hoplite. Do not order me around. I may defer to you now and again in combat, but I am a watcher, not your soldier." Her face was actually beginning to turn from a shade of pale to a more crimson hue. Lance was growing angry with him. Why? Why? All he did was assert his role as a commanding officer, as he had done all his life to those lower ranking than himself. But Lance was not a part of the 8th arm of Terna. She was not in the command structure whatsoever. Therefore, While she held no rank in the military, this also meant that Hoplite did not outrank her. This puzzled him for a millisecond of thought before he realized how he should proceed. Lance should be regarded as a civilian combatant, since she was not a part of the structure of command. That gave her more free rein than a standard soldier, as their behavior was typically unpredictable, as was whatever gear they may be in possession of. That didn't mean that civilian combatants shouldn't follow orders, but their wild variation made it difficult to utilize them to their full capabilities. Technically, Lance was a part of the Ternan civilization from a lost colony, but she was not part of any of the Adons. Until proper reintegration, she was not truly Ternan. Perhaps she was right to be irritated with Hoplite for giving her orders outside of combat. No, Hoplite was right. He had to always be certain. If a Hoplite didn't have certainties, their thoughts would always lead to treachery. He would not be re-indoctrinated. If only he had more experience dealing with civilians. Turning his thoughts back to Lance in that same instant of thought, he came to a conclusion. To avoid having this cooperation turn abrasive, Hoplite would concede to this small matter. Perhaps it would be more optimal if Lance was made aware before takeoff. Perhaps preparing herself mentally could keep her from lagging around in her sickness. Her recovery had also been taking up too much time for his liking. From this point going forward, I will notify you approximately 1 second before takeoff. Hoplite replied in his usual monotone. That should be enough to be satisfactory to her. This concession was already more than what Hoplite was used to providing. You don't pick me up until I tell you it's all right, she snapped angrily, her eyes narrowing into a glare that matched Hoplite's own. You tell me when, then I'll tell you if it's all right. I have to mentally prepare, Lance told him, her face growing a deeper shade of red. Affirmative. Hoplite nearly snapped, fully turning and walking away to avoid wasting any more time on this ridiculous conversation. From his rear camera, he could see her give a small but curt nod. Her previous sickness all but evaporated in the heat of her anger. Hoplite's own face felt red-hot with rage. How dare she ask for more from Hoplite after he gave her more than he would have given anyone else? As soon as these savages were reintegrated, they'd need to be taught proper procedure. They walked in icy cold silence for a few minutes, before finally reaching the crash site. As he had every time before, he activated one of the cameras in his finger, and edged the tip just around the tree trunk to scan the area around his shuttle. Before he even saw what was on the camera, his motion tracker had picked up on 7 blips surrounding his pod. Were they nosy watchers or something else? If they had been fiends, they wouldn't have been stationary. Fiends always moved erratically on his motion tracker. They never held still. These were almost completely immobile even, at least in relation to fiends. When Hoplite finally saw what his finger camera's feed picked up on, his mouth almost fell open in shock. 6 people and some horrific kind of mutant were all staring at his shuttle. The mutant had drawn his attention first, due to just how severe the changes were. The top half was a handsome, long, black-haired, muscular humanoid, crossing its arms and looking down upon Hoplite's pod with a curious glint in its black eyes. The lower half, in contrast, was a horrific monstrosity. The upper half's waist, instead of ending in a pair of legs, led into another, larger body. A massive face with a gaping maw and 3 tongues sticking out of its mouth made up the center of this second torso, one of the tongues reaching up occasionally to lick one of the creature's 2 big black eyes. Its bold nose hung slightly over the gaping three-tongued maw, which masticated the back of the three lolling tongues. Another set of inhumanly large shoulders stuck out from above this second horrific face, each with a long ape-like arm that ended in two broad furrowed fingers that each ended in a sharp point. The thing held itself aloft, with two thick squat legs, using its two lower arms for better balance. Hoplite had never seen such a massive mutation in his life. If Darkwatch were to see such a mutant on this world, they'd surely designate Akulis for liquidization with barely a second thought. Not that this strange creature was the only mutant in this strange gathering. There was also a lean crimson-skinned man that stood near to the mouth of Hoplite's pod. Long black horns like that of a goat jutted out from his temples above a head of unkempt long